Welcome back to the Wealthologist Weekly, where every week we like to take some time to break down financial planning, wealth management, and what's going on in the economy in a way that's informative and hopefully digestible for you. I'm Chris Hobart, known as the Wealthologist, and today, we're going to dive into some numbers and we're going to talk specifically about the state of the U.S. economy. Good news is we're not going to talk about politics. It seems like that's all they're talking about on the news right now. Instead, I want to take a look at the U.S. economy without the political view of everything. I want to go ahead and warn you. We're going to dive into some deep numbers, and it can get a little bit heavy on some of this stuff, but I also want you to understand all of the important pieces that make up the GDP for the United States and how that kind of shows us what economic health looks like. So, the important thing to look at right now is there are signs that the U.S. economy or our growth is slowing down a bit. And the initial way we're going to look at this is jobless claims. That's a key economic indicator, and they've averaged 235,000 per week over the last 4 weeks. Now, that's compared to 211,000 in the first quarter. So what does this mean? It means that more people are filing for unemployment benefits, which is a sign of a cooling job market. Continuing jobless claims are also on the rise, and overall retail sales have actually slowed down a little bit. Now, they've still increased by 0.2% in the past 6 months, but this growth is slower than the pace of inflation, and that's an indication that people are spending less money, which obviously can have an impact on the economy because consumer spending is a big part of the growth of the U.S. economy. Now, I do want to touch on inflation. You see, consumer prices actually ticked down by 0.1% in June, which suggests that the efforts to control the inflation are starting to actually work. I know we're all excited about that, but by 0.1% really doesn't have that big of an impact, right? Now, this drop in prices is linked to the reduction in the money supply, which has been decreasing since early 2022. Why this is important? You might remember we've talked about this before. The money supply increased by 40% during the COVID era. Since 2022, slowly they've been pulling that money supply back, which should help with inflation. Now, another factor to consider is the budget deficit for the U.S. Now, last year, the budget deficit would have been 7.5% of GDP if it weren't for the Supreme Court's decision to overturn much of President Biden's plan to forgive all those student loans. Now, this deficit was larger than any year on record when the U.S. was not engaged in a world war and the unemployment rate was below 4%. So I want to take some time now and I want to take a look at real GDP, which the estimate that we're looking at expanded at 2.1% annual for the second quarter. And now that's primarily due to an increase in consumer spending. Remember, consumer spending is a big push with all of this. Now, I want to tell you, the estimate we're talking about with GDP, it's not final because there's some upcoming reports on international trade and inventories that could lead to some adjustments. And we'll let you know about those if it's important going forward. But let's touch on consumer spending because, as I talked about before, this is crucial to the economy. Now, when we talk about real retail sales, and that's inflation adjusted, outside of the auto sector, it actually only grew at about 0.3% annual rate in Q2. But here's the thing, auto sales actually went through the roof at a 9.8% rate. Real services, which make up most consumer spending, they grew at about a 2.1% pace. So overall, we estimate that the real consumer spending on goods and services combined to increase at 2.1% rate, which when we talk about the GDP, that contributed 1.4 points to the real GDP growth rate. Now, business investment is another big piece of the GDP, and that grew at 1.7% rate, with intellectual property was the biggest driver, while things like commercial construction declined slightly. So when we take a look at all the factors and everything, this growth added 0.2% to the real GDP. Now, something else that we've been talking about, higher mortgage rates or higher interest rates leading to higher mortgage rates. But the thing is, it's actually not been that big of a deal for a lot of the construction, specifically when it comes to retail construction, because construction grew at 4.9% rate, which added 0.2 points to the real GDP as well. Now, the government when they make purchases, that's also what we calculate inside of GDP calculations. And their spending, the government spending, grew at 1.7% rate in Q2, which added 0.3 points to the GDP growth rate as well. Now, we're going to change some perspective here. You see, because the trade deficit actually expanded in Q2 with imports growing faster than exports. So we're buying more, bringing more in than we're sending out. Now, this larger trade deficit actually means slower growth. Now, even though exports and imports both increased, but we estimate that the net exports subtracted 0.8% points from real GDP growth. Some other things that we look at that are important is inventory accumulation. It picked up in Q2 compared to Q1, translating into a 0.8% addition to the growth rate of real GDP. Now, here we go. I told you we had a lot of deep numbers. So adding everything up, we get a 2.1% annual real GDP growth rate for the second quarter. Now, this is good news compared to a recession. But it's not a great starting point if a tighter monetary policy starts to have a stronger impact, which is what we're seeing. So you're probably sitting there saying, what does all this mean for my financial planning and wealth management? All of these things, all of these moving pieces and parts, while it can be very heavy, it's important for you to understand at least that somebody's keeping an eye on those, and for you on some level to stay informed and prepared. Because economic changes can and will impact investments, spending, and saving strategies. Now, at Hobart Wealth, we're here to help you navigate these changes and keep your financial future on track. And we're always available for you when you have questions. So I want to thank you for tuning in this week to the Wealthologist Weekly. I'm going to encourage you, stay informed, stay proactive, and remember, we are here to help you make those smart financial decisions. As always, I'm Chris Hobart, the Wealthologist, and I'll see you next week. Have a great one.